Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to take you back 5 years. 5 years ago, almost to the day, I am on my hands and knees on the floor of a 100-year-old gymnasium with brand new wood that they placed down in the Durfee Innovation Society. Because when we came up with this crazy idea to do the Purpose Summit, the very first one ever in a repurposed school in inner city Detroit in a blighted neighborhood led by Life Remodeled and Dr. Chris Lambert, who, by the way, had a phenomenal nonprofit session today, if you didn't hear it. Hey, anyone in that session? Woo! Great things about that, brother. Great things. Hey, be proud of that. You know what I mean by that. So good. So I'm on my hands and knees on the floor in this gymnasium, and I am taking Velcro and these rolling things of felt and putting them down on the floor so we don't scratch this brand new gymnasium floor. Because what we did is we did the sponsor expo in the gymnasium, and we had all of these tables set up, and I'm there with literally just by myself setting this thing up the day before the Purpose Summit on a Sunday afternoon. And then we went into the auditorium, and I had two friends show up, and we were setting up folding chairs, one after the other, and I'm a sweaty mess, and we get done, and it's Sunday night, and I don't know who's coming the next morning. And I made the mistake of watching this thing called Fyre Fest. Did anybody ever see that? Woo! Big mistake. Huge, right? So all I'm thinking in my head as I'm laying out this felt and we're setting up these chairs and I'm looking at this empty gymnasium and I'm looking at this empty auditorium is, what if nobody shows up? And this was all for nothing. And the next morning, doors open with no marketing, no real money, just an idea and sweat labor and some people who believed in this thing. 300 people walked into the auditorium of Durfee Innovation Society, and we had a 2-day conversation that was absolutely transformative. And things didn't go the way that we thought they would. We had plans, we had goals, we had expectations. We didn't deliver on them. And you know what I was thinking about for those entire 2 days? What we didn't accomplish. And you know what Dr. Chris Lambert said to me? Be proud of this. And those words carried me from that moment forward to this mission that we are now on together. That was a springboard to what led to a multiple city speaking tour. I had the opportunity to speak on stages across the country with different companies, with different organizations on this concept of the power of purpose, which was the keynote talk that I gave at the summit in 2019. And then that conversation led to writing a book called Helping People Find Purpose at Work. And I struggled to write this book. I was not a writer. I was not an author. Every time I tried to sit down and write, I couldn't gather my thoughts. I was distracted. And I was thinking, what if I write this book and no one reads it? No one buys it. And it's all for nothing. And then my wife and I get invited to this conference in November. We're excited to go to this conference. It was at the Boca Raton Resort in Florida. Everything paid for. We desperately needed it because we've got 2 young kids. We had not been on a vacation in 3 years by ourselves, and I was so looking forward to this. And 3 days before the trip, she gets pneumonia, and we can't go. And the organizers say, no problem. Listen, we've got a makeup conference in Laguna Beach, California. And so I said, great, we'll be there. When is it? And they said February 27th and 28th. And so one of the organizations that I was speaking with at the time had a client out in California, and I called them and said, hey, listen, I'm coming in town to this conference. I really enjoyed our time together. I would love to get together and have dinner with you the night before. Are you available? And they said, when are you coming in? And I said, the 26th. And they said, could you come in on the 25th? And I said, why? And they said, because we've got this meeting that we're having, and we'd love to have you speak at it. Can you come in a day early? And I said, yeah, I would love to. And so now I'm coming in a day early, and I'm going to speak at this thing, and then I'm going to go to this other conference, and then I'm going to come home. And then I get another phone call from another company that says, hey, we heard you're coming to the West Coast. Will you come to Lake Tahoe on March 5th? we've got a symposium at Lake Tahoe. And I'm like, well, I'm already on the West Coast, so I'm not going to fly all the way back home and then fly back to California. So while I'm there, why don't I just stay on the west side? And I'll use the time in between March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd to get the book done that I've been struggling to write. Sit at the Marriott Cliffs Resort, look over the Pacific Ocean, and just spend some time writing. And so then I get this phone call. And the phone call is from the Ken Blanchard companies. Now, Ken Blanchard had been a mentor of mine for 20 years. I learned so much about servant leadership, how to lead people, how to lead organizations from Ken Blanchard. And I get this incredible phone call from Michelle Schoen, who's in the back of the room, and she says, would you come to our Channel Partner Conference in San Diego? And I said, when's the Channel Partner Conference? And she said, March 1st and 2nd. And I said, you know, it's amazing that you're asking me that because I'm actually going to be in Laguna Beach the weekend before, and I have to go to Lake Tahoe there. Yeah, I'll just change my flights. I'll drive down to San Diego. I'll come to your conference, and then I'll fly to Lake Tahoe, and then I'll fly home. By the way, this is February and March of 2020. I show up in San Diego, and Michelle says, Davin, we are so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for coming. And I said, Michelle, I am so grateful to be here. Ken has poured so much into my life. I can't wait to learn from all the channel partners, be able to pour back into their lives. And I've always wanted to meet Ken. Is he going to be here? And she says, he just walked in behind you. And I turned around and I said, Ken, I've waited 20 years to meet you. And he says, I won't hold that against you, young man. Tell me, have you had eggs? And I said, have I had eggs? He's like, why don't we go get some eggs? And he puts his arm around me, and he's got his cane, and we walk to a round table like this in the back of the conference room, and we sit there for an hour, and he's talking to me, and he's asking me all these questions. I had all these questions that I wanted to ask him, and I didn't get I couldn't ask because he was just so interested in me. And then he said, have you written anything on this purpose stuff yet? Because what you have to say is really important, and people need to hear it. And I said, actually, I'm supposed to be writing a book right now in Laguna Beach, but I changed my flights to come down here to be here for your channel partner conference. And he said, when that book is finished, will you send it to me because I'd like to write the foreword to that book? And my mouth falls. I'm texting my wife. I'm sitting having breakfast with Ken Blanchard. He just wrote the foreword of my book. And I can't believe that this moment is happening. And I spend the rest of the day with Ken. I'll never forget that day. And that night, I'm sitting at his dinner table. I still have the picture, Michelle, of Ken and I with the little button that says, I love Ken. And his wife, Margie, it literally was a button that said, I love Ken on my lanyard. Not in that way. No, but really, I do. He's a mentor. But we get done dinner, and his wife, Margie, was sick that night. And he goes, okay, I need to go home to my bride, so please excuse me. And he gets up, and he starts walking to the door, and then he stops. And he grabs his cane. And he points it at me, and he says, now you better get writing, young man. I'm not getting any younger. And I left, and I got on that plane, and I started typing. I went to Lake Tahoe. I finished my talk at Lake Tahoe. That's March 5th. I come home March 6th, and what happened 6 days later? The world shut down. And that was a tough time. And I was thrust into the basement, and I finished that book because all I was thinking is, gosh, what if something happens initially to Ken before I finish writing this book? What if he gets COVID? And then I thought, what if I get COVID and I can't finish the book? What are the words that I want to depart and leave on the world if I get COVID and I'm not going to be here? Because we were all suddenly thrusted into our mortality during COVID. And so that kind of gave us the courage to be our most vulnerable selves in that moment. And somewhere over the last 5 years, I think we've lost that. And as terrible as COVID was, I think there's a learning moment in there for us. And so we emerge out of COVID and we say, you know what, we need to do the Purpose Summit again. And we don't know where we're going to do it because conferences are illegal in Michigan at the time. And so we're trying to figure out how could we possibly do this. And we get this phone call from someone who came to the first Purpose Summit in 2019. And they said, you should do the Purpose Summit in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And I said, who's going to come to Mount Clemens, Michigan for the Purpose Summit? And he said, you didn't think 300 people were going to show up in a repurposed school building in a blighted neighborhood in Detroit. And I was like, whew, okay. Let's figure out how to do the Purpose Summit in Mount Clemens, Michigan, right? This town that is economically challenged about 30 minutes north of Detroit. And so we start walking the city, and there's this old abandoned theater. And he said, what if you did your keynotes in this theater? And I said, well, that's great, but where would we do the breakout sessions? Well, Oakland University had just opened up a school across the street. And he says, well, what if you did the breakouts at Oakland University? And I said, well, that would be awesome. We could do that there across the street. But how would we feed people? Where would we hold a reception? And he said, what if we partnered with the city and we closed the street in between and we put up wedding tents and we had all of the restaurants that were struggling economically due to COVID cater the dinner, and we just did tickets and we figured out how to reconcile it afterwards. And a vision came together, and an amazing team, people like Lisa Oprita and Adam Ritchie and Corrine Forrest. Literally over the next days, we spent on the floor in a theater, setting up chairs, setting up a sign. I remember Corrine and I setting up a sign that said Purpose Summit across the bottom, and the P kept on falling, and we kept on trying to stick it up with tape over and over. And Corrine's like, if I just have to stand behind this P the entire time, I'll stand behind this P the entire time. She's got a weird sense of humor. I love her dearly. You got to meet her if you haven't met her. So the Purpose Summit happens, and this company from South Bend, Indiana shows up, and they bring 26 leaders to the Purpose Summit, led by Dr. Amber Selking, who you've met here tonight. And we were in crisis mode because, as I shared before, people were showing up. We weren't ready. They came off. They saved us. And then they said, hey, this is an incredible transformative leadership experience. And Dr. Amber Selking says, what if we did this in Indiana? And I said, well, where would we do it in Indiana? And she said, well, what if we did it at the University of Notre Dame? I said, we could do that? She says, well, I'm the mental performance coach of Notre Dame football. I'm an adjunct professor. Let me make a phone call. And she makes a phone call. And then a few days later go by, and she says, hey, I was doing laps around Notre Dame Stadium, and I just felt I needed to stop here. And she took a picture of the side of the stadium, and she sends it to me. And she says, this is where the Purpose Summit's going to be next year. And I said, Notre Dame Stadium? What happens if it rains? What if it rains? We can't get 80,000 people into a stadium. She's like, I don't know what to tell you. This is where the Purpose Summit's going to be. What I didn't know was at the top of Notre Dame Stadium was a glass ballroom that looked like suites, that overlooked the field, that fit 1,000 people. And so now we're like, okay, we could see how this happened. Our team got together, and we said, do we move the summit from our Detroit market to Notre Dame? What if nobody else comes? What if we don't get the sponsors? What if it's a failure? And we went to Notre Dame, and 500 people and over 200 companies from across the country descended on South Bend, Indiana. People flew from Europe to Chicago and rented cars to go to South Bend for the Purpose Summit in 2022. And then we did it again. And then companies like Broad River Retail and Coca-Cola Consolidated and others came to South Bend, and they said, what if you did something like this in Charlotte? Maybe not this, but maybe something like this in Charlotte. Those were actually Charlie Maloof's exact words. And I said, well, what if we did the Purpose Summit in Charlotte? And then we started to struggle with, but what if people didn't come? What if we couldn't find the sponsorships to pull it off? What if it was a failure? You see, I had all of these what ifs in my head, and it could have gone either way. But what if your what if is an invitation to your purpose? You see, right now, there are a bunch of thieves that are trying to rob you of the purpose that you are meant to step into when you leave the Purpose Summit this year. There is conviction within you about things that maybe you need to change in your life, things you need to change in your organization, things you need to change in your marriage, things that you need to change in the way that you parent, things that you need to change in the way that you lead others. But there's distraction, there's comparison, there's fear, worry, doubt, unbelief, and excuses that are preventing you from stepping into the purpose that you know in the depths of your soul that you are supposed to step into when you leave here today. And I want to challenge you today The only difference between which way those what ifs end up is your belief. The question doesn't change. The question is what if. But the deeper question is what is it that you believe? Because the outcome of that what if is directly tied to your level of belief. Now let me tell you about how this almost didn't happen, and how the person standing before you today, 5 days ago, was on his hands and knees again, but this time not rolling out felt, but in a weeping puddle of mess with my wife's arms wrapped around me and me saying, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too much. It's too hard. It's too much of a burden to bear. You see, we poured everything that we had into this. Everything. All of our life savings, leveraged our home, all of it. Because we believe that each and every single person should step into the purpose that they were created for. We believe that every single organization should step into the purpose beyond just profit that they exist for, to change the world, to change the 85% that I talked about earlier that wake up every day without purpose, without meaning, without fulfillment in their life, so that they could go home and give their families their best instead of their leftovers, so that they could put their head on their pillow at night and know that you made a difference, that this is why I got up today. We believed we could do that. And you see, to put something like this on, in addition to amazing people, amazing partners, amazing supporters, it takes finances. It takes leveraging what you have. And so we had this line of credit that every single year we kind of leverage to put this on, and then after the summit, we always reconcile it with, sponsors and then tickets for next year and all that. We do this dance every single year. Like, are we going to have enough? What if we don't have enough? And every year it happens. People show up, it happens. But this time, on Thursday last week, I went to go pull our line of credit to cover this wonderful experience that we all got to enjoy. And for the first time in 3 years, the bank called me and they said, what do you need this money for? And I said, for the summit that we do every single year. And they said, well, we recently changed our policy, and we now need to approve every single withdrawal. We'll get back to you. And I get an email as soon as I hang up the phone that says, your request is denied, your account suspended for 30 days. 5 days ago. And all I'm thinking about is how are we going to feed the people who are coming? How are we going to put this thing on? And I fall to my knees, and I look at my wife, and I say, I don't want to do it anymore. It's just too hard. And she says, get up. Get up. There's a reason that you were chosen for such a time as this. And the next morning, I went into the office, and Lisa looks at me, and she goes, listen, they're coming. One way or another, they're coming. So we need to figure this thing out. You don't have time for this pity party. Get up. And I get up. And I start praying and trying to figure out what are we going to do. And in that moment, Roger Norberg, our chair from C12, happened to be walking down the streets in downtown Rochester and stops in our office and says, hey, I was in town and I felt I needed to come in and give you a hug. And he walks in and I tell him what happened. And he says, can I send out a prayer message to all of our C12 members? I said, please do. So he does. And we're sitting in our conference room. Lisa is literally putting stickers on name badges of people who waited till last week to register. Thank you, each and every single one of you who did that. Because we have to order those name badges like 2 weeks in advance. There's a reason there's a cutoff date. And then she manually, literally puts stickers on every single name badge. And Adam Ritchie is working with this Cricut to put the little tiny little letters on there underneath each and every single one of them. And I'm on my computer doing something. I don't know what I was doing. It was all a blur. And I get this text message from John Sanchez, our CPA, who says, call me. I think I can help you out. And I called John, and I said, John, what's going on? He goes, I'm sitting in McNamara Airport with my son. We're about to go on a fishing trip, and our plane is delayed. And I'm at the gate, and I'm reading my emails, and I see Roger's prayer request. So I start praying, hang my phone up, and then I get a phone call from one of my other clients. And the client says, hey, John, listen, I got a question. I'm sitting on some money in the bank, and it's not really getting good interest, and I don't want to put it in the market because it's too risky. I want to do something special with it. You have any ideas? And John says, I got to tell you about my friend Davin and this Purpose Summit thing that they do. Maybe it's something you might want to help out with, maybe not, but I'll have you talk to him. He says, tell him to give me a call. So I call Jim and tell him the whole story, and Jim says, hey, this sounds really great. Let me get my son Greg on the phone. He handles kind of all of our affairs. And Greg gets on the phone, and he says, yep, sounds great. Do you have a good attorney? And I said, yes, I have a good attorney, but I don't know if we're going to turn this around with my attorney in time that we need to turn this around, if you know how sometimes attorneys work. No offense to any attorneys who are in the room, right? And I don't want to be billed by hour for doing that. But anyway, we have a great attorney. They're a great legal team. But he says, okay, well, let me see what we can do. I'll get back to you by the end of the day. End of the day comes, nothing. Next morning, Friday morning. Today's Tuesday, folks. This is Friday. I'm in my office, and we have a Friday morning C12 call, me, Roger, Adam, and a couple other people. And every Friday morning, we've got this call from 8:30 to 9:30. And we're talking about things for C12. And then at 9:23, Adam says, I've been doing these like 7-minute pop-up prayer moments. And maybe you should do that. And it's 9:23, and Roger says, well, there's 7 minutes left in the call. Why don't we end the call so you can do that? And then he looks at me and he says, when's the last time you played that piano behind you? Because I've got a piano in our office because I lead worship at our church. And I said, Roger, it's been a minute. He goes, well, why don't we hang up the phone and why don't you go spend some time at the Keys? Now, Nick Craig will tell you that the way that I often handle stress is sitting at a piano, and he encourages me that I should do it more often. And I hadn't done it in a while in our office. So I go and I sit at the piano, and it's just me in the office, and I finish playing at exactly 9:30, and Lisa Oprita walks in the door, and she's like, it's go time. Let's pack it up. We need to get to Charlotte. We're flying out on Sunday. And I look at my email, and there's the promissory note from Greg from the night before, and says, my father, Jim, will be in touch. Meet him at the bank at noon. I call Jim. I have to drive a half hour to meet him in the bank. I drive him to the bank. I walk in, and there's this guy, Jim, 91 years old with a cane, and he's standing there. And he says, Davin, I'm so glad you're here. It's great to meet you. Heard your great story. We'd love to help you out. And he says, here's the terms, here's the payback period, all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. He goes, tell me more about this summit. And I tell him I said, I can't thank you enough for what you're allowing to make happen for all of these people who don't even know you next week in Charlotte. And we handle what we need to handle, and then we sit down. And he goes, tell me, you know a lot of business people. Why didn't you just ask for the money? And I said, because, Jim, I've never asked anybody for money. It just feels uncomfortable to do that. I've shared them with the situation, and I just kind of left it up to God for him to put it upon the hearts of those that might want to step in. And he goes, well, why me? And I said, Jim, I don't know. But what if there's a reason that we're supposed to meet? What if I'm supposed to help your son in some way in the future? What if I'm supposed to help your family in some way in the future? I don't know why you're here, but I know there's a what if. And I can't wait to see what that what if is. And so then he says, okay, well, I wish you well on your summit. And we start walking to the door, and I said, this has been such an incredible moment in this journey for us. I'm writing a second book called The Thieves of Purpose, the things that rob us of our purpose, like comparison, distraction, doubt, worry, fear, excuses, unbelief. But I'm struggling to finish the book, and it's due to my publisher at the end of June. And I've got the summit, and then I need to go to Europe I get to go to Europe for a speaking thing, and then come back, and then we're hopefully moving from Michigan to Charlotte in June or July, and somewhere along that lines, I need to finish a book and get it to my publisher at the end of June. And I'm struggling. What if I don't get it done? And he looks at me, and I said, I want to include this story in the book, if that's okay. And he said, that would be wonderful. I'm honored. Thank you. And we start walking out, and he stops. And he turns to me, and he points his cane. And he says, now you better get writing, young man. I'm not getting any younger. And I said, Jim, I know it was why it was you. Sit back down. I have a story to tell you. You see, we don't know why the circumstances that we are in happen. They are layered with what ifs. And those what ifs are laced with fear, doubt, and unbelief. And a couple years ago, a dear friend of mine who I've known for 15 years came to our home church of Rock Point, and he delivered this amazing message called Do It Afraid. And it was at a really, really challenging time in our life that I wanted to give up, that I didn't want to do it anymore. And we came back from that service, and my wife has this little board that she puts little letters on with cute little sayings, and it sits in our kitchen. And I came home that day, and it just said, Do It Afraid on the board. And every single day, I would get up. And when I didn't want to step into my what if, I would look at that, and I would remember Kent's voice, Do It Afraid. Every single time it got hard, I remembered Kent's voice, Do It Afraid. And so there is a what if in your life right now. There are circumstances that you don't understand why maybe you were led to the edge of the Red Sea and it didn't part. There are circumstances that you don't understand why the provision didn't come in the way that you needed to come when you needed to come. There are challenges that you are facing that you are trying to make sense of, and you quite can't. But I promise you, you might not know it today. You might not know it 3 days from now. You might not know it 3 years from now. You might know it 5 years from now. But there is a what if in there that if you continue to press through and do it afraid, your story is going to be an inspiration for someone else who is dealing with their what if. And so I want to encourage you. Thank you. I want to encourage you to lean in. I want to encourage you to lean in to the what ifs in your life without doubt, without unbelief, but maybe with fear. And maybe that fear is healthy. Because for me it was. Because I had this message of do it afraid. You see, fear sometimes can be an indication that the thing that you are meant to step most into is the purpose that you were created most for. Thank you.